He had seen it all, or at least he thought he had. For over 2 decades, the man known simply as Jim the Guide had led nighttime tours through some of the most haunted properties in the American South. He had walked guests through blood-soaked history, recounted stories of shadow figures, poltergeist activity, and even personal accounts of being touched, scratched, and followed. Skeptics called him theatrical. Believers called him brave. But Jim never tried to convince anyone. He always said, "I don't tell you what to believe, I just tell you what happened." He had grown up with ghost stories, passed down through generations. His own grandmother claimed to see spirits lingering in mirrors and said the dead could be heard in the wind if you listened closely. Jim had learned to keep an open mind, but he also developed a calm, steady demeanor. He was the guy people relied on when the lights flickered or someone panicked during a seance. Always composed, always skeptical enough not to fall into hysteria. That's why when Jim cancelled a tour midway for the first time in 20 years, people knew something was very, very wrong. It happened during a new route, one recently opened to the public in collaboration with a private collector of paranormal objects. Among the items featured was the supposed real Annabelle doll. Not the Hollywood prop, but the one tied to decades of chilling stories. According to the collector, the doll had been kept sealed under intense conditions with various protective measures in place. When Jim was first asked to include the doll in his tour, he hesitated. He wasn't superstitious, but something about that request made him uneasy. He finally agreed, but only under strict conditions. The doll would remain locked in a secure case, untouched, and off limits to everyone. For the first few nights, everything went according to plan. Crowds were bigger than ever. The allure of Annabelle brought in guests from across the country. Some laughed nervously as they approached the glass case. Others stared with wide eyes, whispering prayers under their breath. Jim, as always, stood off to the side, recounting the doll's history. How it had allegedly moved on its own. How previous owners reported terrifying phenomena. How spiritual experts had tried to cleanse it with little success. He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He simply shared the facts, letting the guests form their own opinions. Then came that night. Jim was already feeling off before the tour began. The air was thick. His flashlight flickered more than usual. He even thought he heard whispering in the empty hallway while waiting for the group to arrive. He shook it off. Probably nerves, probably tired. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. The tour progressed as usual until they reached the 3rd floor, the room where the doll was displayed. Jim began his usual narration. He turned to gesture toward the case. That's when it hit him. The doll was gone. At first, he thought it was a prank, some clever setup by the collector or a staff member. But then he saw the expressions on the guests' faces. Pure, unfiltered fear. Some stepped back. One woman dropped her phone. A man near the back whispered, "Where did it go?" Jim couldn't answer. He couldn't even breathe properly. For a moment, everything went still. So still it felt like the room had been vacuumed of sound, of warmth, of time itself. Jim would later say that standing in that room, with an empty glass case and a dozen terrified guests, was the most afraid he had ever been in his life. The night had started like any other. A light drizzle coated the gravel path outside the Nottoway plantation, and the tour group gathered under dim lanterns, some with umbrellas, others clutching coats tightly around themselves. Laughter echoed, at first, nervous, skeptical, the usual blend of curiosity and disbelief that haunted tours often attract. But that night, they were there for something more specific. Word had spread quickly. The infamous Annabelle doll, the real one, according to the collector, was now part of the tour for a limited time. People wanted to see it for themselves. The object that had reportedly scratched, possessed, and terrified those who dared to disturb it. The doll was displayed in a room on the 3rd floor of the plantation, behind thick glass reinforced with steel brackets. It had been secured by the collector himself, a man who claimed to have handled over 100 cursed artifacts, yet never seemed entirely comfortable around this one. The case was padlocked. Protective sigils were drawn in chalk near the base. There were warnings not to touch the glass, not to provoke the spirit, and certainly not to take flash photos. Jim, the tour guide, always reminded visitors to treat the doll with respect, not for theatrics, but for safety. That night's group was smaller than usual, only 11 people, most of them from out of state, a mix of thrill seekers, amateur ghost hunters, and one quiet woman who said nothing the entire time, just clutched her rosary beads and kept looking over her shoulder. As the tour ascended to the 3rd floor, the energy changed. Several guests later described the air as thick and heavy, like walking into a room that had been sealed shut for years. One person said it felt like stepping underwater. They arrived at the room. The door creaked open slowly, and the group filed in, murmuring to each other, phones raised for pictures and video. Jim began his practice speech, recounting the origin of the doll, how it was believed to be inhabited by a malevolent spirit, how priests had attempted to bless it, and how it had once reportedly caused a fatal car crash shortly after being moved. He gestured toward the case behind him, and then froze. The case was empty. At first, the group thought it was part of the act, a clever scare tactic, maybe a planned jump scare with the doll rigged to fall from the ceiling or slide from under a table. But Jim's face said otherwise. He stepped forward, mouth slightly open, eyes locked on the empty space where the doll had been just a day before. The glass wasn't broken. The locks were still intact. The chalk markings were untouched. Silence settled over the group. Unnatural, oppressive. One guest whispered, "This isn't part of the tour, is it?" Another backed out of the room entirely. The woman with the rosary began to pray softly. Jim reached for his walkie-talkie to contact staff, but got only static in response. Then the air grew colder. Several guests noticed their breath forming in front of them, despite the humid Louisiana air. Phones began glitching. One by one, flashlights flickered or shut off completely. A man near the back turned to leave and let out a sharp cry. He said he felt something brush against his neck. Not wind, not air, fingers. Panic began to rise. Guests moved quickly toward the door, some running, others stumbling. One woman dropped to her knees, gasping as though she couldn't breathe. Jim tried to calm everyone, but his voice barely carried. He knew he had to shut down the tour, get everyone out, and contact the authorities or the collector. But even as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing, his eyes kept going back to the empty case. There was no explanation for it. No one had access. No one had come in or out. Security on that floor was strict, and the room had been locked all day. Yet, the doll was gone. The glass case was designed to be tamper-proof. Heavy, reinforced, and sealed with both physical locks and symbolic protections, it stood as the centerpiece of the room on the 3rd floor of the Nottoway plantation. Visitors were allowed to approach it, but not touch. They could take pictures, without flash. The rules were clear, and they weren't just there for preservation. According to the collector, those precautions were necessary to contain whatever force was believed to reside inside the doll. In the days leading up to the incident, everything had functioned smoothly. The locks were inspected daily, the case was cleaned from the outside with gloves, and no one aside from authorized staff was allowed within 10 feet of the display without supervision. The collector himself had warned that even joking around, the doll could invite energy shifts. Most people laughed it off. The tour guides, including Jim, had their doubts too, but none wanted to test those boundaries. It wasn't worth the risk. But on the night of the vanishing, the case was found open, only not in the way anyone expected. The locks were still fastened, the seals unbroken. No damage, no scratches, not even fingerprints where the doll had rested. It was as if the doll had evaporated from within, leaving nothing but the faint outline of where it once sat on the red velvet cloth inside. The plantation's internal staff were called in to check everything. Security footage was reviewed, though the cameras in the room had gone dark for several minutes. Infrared, motion sensors, even the humidity control system registered nothing abnormal during the window when the doll disappeared. Yet every physical sign confirmed the impossible. The case had never been opened, and the room had never been entered or exited. Jim, shaken, kept replaying the scene in his mind. He had spoken those same words dozens of times before, pointing to the case, expecting to see the doll looking back. But this time, there was only a hollow space. His voice had caught in his throat, and for a moment, he stood frozen, trying to reconcile what he saw with what he knew should be. One guest had crept closer, peering through the glass to see if maybe the doll had fallen. But there was nothing. No disturbance, no broken glass, not a single thread of the doll's dress left behind. And that was perhaps the most disturbing part of all. If someone had stolen it, there would have been evidence. If it had been a prank, the logistics of pulling it off in front of so many people would have been staggering. But there was nothing. Just emptiness. An eerie kind of stillness that filled the room. The collector was contacted immediately. He arrived within hours, breathless and visibly disturbed. He didn't speak to the guests, didn't even ask for a full report. He simply examined the case, ran his fingers along the frame, muttered something under his breath, and left without another word. One staff member said he looked afraid, not concerned, not angry, but truly afraid, as if something he had feared for a long time had finally happened. Maintenance teams ran diagnostics on the display case. They checked for defects, malfunctions, environmental shifts, anything that might explain what had happened. The glass was pristine, and the metal was free from tampering. Even the surveillance equipment in the hallway showed nothing entering or exiting the room in the time frame. No shadows, no figures, no anomalies. What was most unsettling, though, wasn't what was missing. It was what remained. The protective sigils drawn beneath the case were still intact, but something was different. Faded, smudged in ways that hadn't been before, almost as if something had passed over them. Something with weight, something with intent. When the doll vanished, one of the first questions asked was about the security footage. The room was equipped with 3 separate cameras, one positioned directly above the glass case, one facing the room entrance, and one placed in the upper corner to capture a wide view of the interior. These cameras were connected to a high-capacity DVR system that recorded 24/7, with backup batteries in case of power failure. The collector had insisted on this level of surveillance, not just to prevent theft, but because he believed that paranormal energy often interfered with technology, and capturing such anomalies could provide vital clues. But what investigators found when they reviewed the footage was far more disturbing than anyone had expected. At exactly 12:03 a.m., the camera aimed directly at the case suddenly cut to black. No warning, no glitch, no visible interruption, just a clean, immediate blackout. The other 2 cameras continued recording, but their feeds showed something equally strange. The lights in the room flickered, then dimmed, yet no one appeared to enter or leave. There were no shadows, no doors opening, no movement at all. It was as though time itself had paused. Then, precisely 6 minutes and 66 seconds later, an unsettling number on its own, the camera feed resumed. The case was still in view, but the doll was gone. No sound was captured, no sign of forced entry or physical movement. It had simply vanished during the blackout window. The timestamp was intact. The system logs showed no errors, no tampering, and no gaps other than those specific minutes. Staff members who reviewed the footage were visibly disturbed. Several refused to watch it more than once. One technician reported feeling nauseated during playback, especially at the moment when the feed returned. He described a strange, low hum, barely audible, more of a vibration than a sound, that lasted only a few seconds, but left him dizzy and disoriented. Another said she felt as though something was watching her while she worked on the footage, a sensation so intense she had to take a break and step outside. Word of the missing time spread quickly among the plantation employees. Some speculated it was a technical glitch, but others weren't so sure. A few began researching the significance of the time, 6 minutes and 66 seconds. It equated to 7 minutes and 6 seconds in standard time, but the numeric sequence 666 carried heavy symbolic meaning, particularly within occult and religious communities. Some believed it was a message, a sign that what happened wasn't random at all. The local tech specialist was brought in to conduct a deeper forensic analysis of the security system. He combed through the code, examined the servers, and checked for possible external interference. But everything checked out. The system was clean, untouched. There were no viruses, no malware, no power surges. In fact, he noted that the blackout was unnaturally precise, too perfect to be the result of a typical failure. The system behaved as if someone or something had intentionally blacked it out and then restored it, leaving no trace behind. Even more unsettling was the realization that during those 6 minutes and 66 seconds, not a single person in the house recalled seeing anything at all. No strange lights, no sounds, no physical disturbances. Some remembered the room feeling colder. Others said they felt time slow down, but none could recall any event that might explain how the doll had disappeared. It was as if reality itself had skipped a beat, or a curtain had been drawn over the room during that brief span. The collector, when told about the missing time and the numerical sequence, said only one thing: "It's not the first time this has happened." He didn't elaborate, and no further footage was released to the public. What exactly occurred during those minutes remains unknown. In the moments following the discovery that the doll had vanished, chaos slowly began to spread among the group. At first, there was confusion, whispered questions, and nervous laughter. But within minutes, that confusion gave way to genuine fear. People began to feel uneasy, as if the air in the room had turned dense and charged. The temperature dropped sharply, and several guests instinctively crossed their arms or rubbed their shoulders, trying to ward off the sudden chill that had no logical source. What had been a routine ghost tour was shifting into something entirely different, something far more real. The first sign that something wasn't right came from the woman standing closest to the glass case. She was the only one brave enough to approach it after Jim pointed out the doll was missing. She leaned in to peer through the glass, perhaps expecting to see the doll tipped over or partially hidden behind the display materials. But before she could say a word, she flinched back, gasping and grabbing her wrist. When others looked, her skin had turned pale, and she claimed she felt a sharp, cold grip around her arm, as though invisible fingers had wrapped themselves tightly around her flesh. The marks left behind weren't scratches, but faint impressions, like something had clutched her with just enough pressure to leave an echo on her skin. Others soon reported strange sensations. A man near the back of the room said he felt a pressure on his chest, like something was leaning into him, slowly pushing the air out of his lungs. He stumbled back against the wall, visibly panicked, and refused to re-enter the room. Another woman, who had been filming the tour on her phone, stared in shock as her screen went completely white. Not black, not frozen, but white, blinding, and empty. When she tried to restart it, the phone wouldn't respond. Moments later, it powered off on its own and refused to turn back on for the rest of the night. The atmosphere had changed completely. A low-frequency sound, almost like a distant hum or rumble, seemed to vibrate through the floor, though no source could be found. Guests began backing out of the room, some whispering prayers, others simply looking pale and dazed. Jim tried to keep people calm, but he was visibly shaken. He had never seen a group react like this. Even the most skeptical guests were no longer laughing. Whatever was happening, it was affecting them on a physical level, something no staged scare or well-told story could ever do. One young man stood near the hallway entrance, looking down the corridor that led back to the staircase. He later told staff that he saw a shadow move across the wall, tall, human-shaped, but unnaturally fast. No one else had been in the hallway at the time, and the lights had not flickered. Yet he was certain something had passed just out of sight. He described the sensation as one of being hunted, of realizing too late that you were not alone in the dark. As the group descended the stairs in hurried silence, another guest whispered to Jim that her hearing had gone out temporarily while in the room. For several seconds, she said, everything had gone completely silent. No footsteps, no voices, not even the sound of her own breathing. She described it as a sensory void, like standing in a vacuum. Then suddenly, the sounds had returned all at once, too loud, too sudden, overwhelming her with noise that left her disoriented and nauseous. Even after they left the third floor, the sense of unease followed them. A few guests complained of headaches and dizziness. One woman was seen crying in the courtyard, saying she felt as if something had attached itself to her. The plantation staff did their best to comfort everyone, but it was clear that this was not a normal incident. Something had happened inside that room, something no one could see, but everyone could feel. In the days following the disappearance of the Annabelle doll, the plantation took on a different atmosphere. Guests still came, drawn in larger numbers than ever before by the viral news of what had occurred. But the mood was no longer that of curious thrill seekers. There was a weight in the air, a lingering tension that crept into every hallway and corner. Tour guides began rotating shifts more frequently. Some requested reassignment to different locations entirely. Even among the seasoned staff, there was an unspoken agreement. Whatever had happened that night wasn't just unexplained, it was dangerous. The collector, usually elusive and reserved, returned to the property repeatedly during those first few days. He didn't speak much to the media, and he never stayed longer than a few hours. But his presence was a clear sign that the situation was more serious than anyone had initially believed. On one of his visits, he arrived carrying a large leather-bound book, visibly aged and filled with handwritten notes and arcane symbols. He was seen walking alone through the third floor, stopping at intervals to inspect the walls, floors, and ceilings. Witnesses later claimed he was chanting under his breath as he moved from room to room, making marks with a stick of white chalk in quiet, deliberate patterns. Rumors began circulating almost immediately. Some said the doll had never been real in the first place, that it was just a clever fake for the sake of showmanship. Others argued that the disappearance was a publicity stunt. But those who had been there that night, especially the guests who experienced physical reactions, insisted otherwise. They described their symptoms to doctors, only to be told nothing was wrong. One woman even underwent a full physical exam after experiencing ongoing insomnia and feelings of dread. Her results came back normal, but she couldn't shake the sensation that something had followed her home. And then the reports started trickling in, first quietly, then more frequently. People who had visited the plantation in the days after the incident began describing strange occurrences. A man from Houston claimed his hotel room door kept unlocking itself throughout the night, even though he had bolted it from the inside. A family from Georgia said their car stereo began playing static and children's laughter while driving home, even though they had no CDs or Bluetooth connected. One woman who had taken a photo near the now empty display case discovered something chilling when she reviewed her pictures. Behind her reflection in the glass, there appeared to be a faint figure watching her. It had no distinct features, only a silhouette with hollow, glowing eyes. Staff began compiling the reports, and a clear pattern emerged. Whatever energy had once been contained inside that glass case was no longer bound to a single location. It was moving, attaching itself, leaving traces behind. The collector warned that the disappearance of the doll could have created a kind of spiritual vacuum, an open invitation for other entities to step through, to inhabit the void left in its place. Without the doll, he said, the protections that had once anchored that specific energy were broken. Whatever was now at large was not just uncontained, it was unpredictable. Out of caution, the plantation restricted access to the third floor indefinitely. Black cloth was draped over the case, salt was scattered along the door thresholds, and religious artifacts were quietly placed in various rooms. Some guests reported hearing footsteps on the floor above them during their visits, even though no one was allowed up there anymore. Lights flickered more frequently. Tour guides started reporting vivid nightmares, some of them involving the dolls standing at the foot of their beds, staring with empty eyes that moved just before waking. The plantation management issued a formal statement calling the event a historical anomaly and refused to comment further. They increased security, hired paranormal consultants, and began reviewing every other artifact in their possession. But the truth remained unsaid. No one knew where the doll had gone, how it had vanished, or what force had made it possible.